It was a serene evening after a long day of teaching and performing miracles. Jesus had just finished feeding a crowd of 5,000 with only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. As the sun began to set, he instructed his disciples to get into a boat and go ahead of him to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. Jesus, needing some time alone to pray, climbed up a mountainside to find solitude. Even with his schedule, Jesus always made time to pray and be at peace with God. Sometimes we must go and be with Jesus with no other people present. Jesus saw the crowds and saw the disciples, but he also saw God who needed to be worshipped. The boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. The wind blew and blew. The wind blew between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. The disciples were far out on the lake, battling strong winds and waves. The boat was being tossed about, and the disciples were growing increasingly anxious. Suddenly, in the early hours of the morning, they saw a figure walking towards them on the water. Terrified, they cried out in fear. "It's a ghost!" one of them shouted, his voice trembling, not recognizing Jesus even though the disciples had been with Jesus for a long time. But Jesus immediately called out to them, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." Peter, still unsure, called back, "Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," Jesus said, his voice calm and reassuring. Peter stepped out of the boat and began to walk on the water toward Jesus. But as he felt the strong wind and saw the waves crashing around him, fear took hold and he began to sink. "Lord, save me," Peter cried out, his voice filled with panic. Immediately, Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said gently. "Why did you doubt?" When we don't focus on Jesus, we begin to weight our problems. If we cry out to Jesus in faith, he will catch us by the hand and raise us above seemingly impossible surroundings. Peter's experience reminds Christians that a lapse of faith is merely a lapse and that the Lord is still there for believers when they call for him. As they climbed back into the boat, the wind died down and the sea became calm. The disciples were in awe, and they worshiped Jesus, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." The boat continued its journey, now with a renewed sense of peace and faith among the disciples. They had witnessed yet another miracle, one that would strengthen their belief and trust in Jesus. Many writers have commented on Peter's walk on water. Some have talked about his lack of faith, which resulted in his beginning to sink. Others have mentioned how he took his eyes off Jesus. Whatever we have to say about Peter, remember that Peter was the only one who got out of the boat and stepped into the waves. Also, he knew the right person to call out to when he began to sink. He didn't ask the other disciples to throw him a line. He asked Jesus to save him. Jesus asked Peter why he doubted. But remember, Peter seemed to have more faith than anyone else on the boat that night.